Hey everyone, this is Nick Kolan at IGN. I'm here with Anthony Gallegos.
Hello.
And we are looking at a dungeon in Tera, the action MMO from Bluehole and Masse Entertainment. Right now, the dungeon is called Bastion, and I'm playing a Slayer, which is a giant sword-wielding maniac. It's a much slower attacker than the warrior. It's probably somewhere between the warrior and the lancer in terms of attack speed.
So this game is currently in closed beta here in the States, but actually is already out internationally.
It's been out in Korea for about a year, but localization takes a while. They've also changed a lot of the art assets for North America. So there are a lot of differences between what Korea has and what we'll be getting.
But the biggest difference between this and, say, what everyone typically thinks of an MMO, Star Wars, World of Warcraft, is that in those ones it's all random dice, like computer-generated fake dice rolls and stuff to determine whether you hit, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, like there's a 10% chance to miss on bosses or whatever. In this case, that's not the case. For your attack to hit, it actually has to collide with the character model, which you can see. I'm swinging swords, and sometimes I'm only just barely hitting that one in the background. So right now I'm not hitting.
It's not like in another game where in MMO you do an attack that can hit everyone around you because it's ability that says so. This, it's like if your sword swing hits two guys, your sword swing hits two guys.
Correct, yeah. There is an ability that the Slayer has that hits like single targets, and it's like the closest target. But that's specific to that ability. But like as a general rule, if I'm hitting things with my sword, they take damage.
So what is the world of Tera?
It's a big fantasy world. It's the continents are allegedly like the bodies of gods who are in love. There's a whole bunch of interestingly enough, there's no like good faction and bad faction. It's just all one faction that's all friendly. Although I think in PvP servers there's world PvP. So,
but the game is very much oriented around PvE rather than a conflict between two armies, which seems to be the way that most MMOs typically.
Now, right now, you're seeing the start of the first boss encounter. This is just some sort of generic enemy NPC, but once she's down, which doesn't take long, she'll summon a gigantic rock golem. You'll see it in a minute.
So for a game where obviously it's much more action focused, so then what are there less abilities, would you say, because you're primarily relying on your auto attack and your dodging?
There are a lot of abilities. A lot of the abilities that you get are sort of based on around combos. So like you'll get an ability that extends off of a second ability. So like you can't use some abilities unless you've dodged first, for example. But there are still going to be a lot of abilities. The website actually has a list of all of the abilities for all of the classes. And it's a pretty long list. But it's all quite easy to use because, for example, the auto attack for the Slayer triggers into an overhand strike, which you'll see a little button appear based on the context, and so I just press spacebar to use that, and then sometimes the overhand strike leads into another ability, so I just press spacebar to use that.
Is the Slayer more the one that you're playing, a Slayer? Is it more of a damage dealing class?
It's definitely a damage dealing class. It doesn't have much in the way of defensive abilities. It just sort of rolls out of the way. It doesn't have much in terms of aggro generating abilities, and it doesn't have much in the way of support abilities. So yeah, it's definitely a damage dealing class, but it can deal different kinds of damage. It can deal like overhead strike, for example, is good when there's a whole bunch of enemies lined up in front of you, whereas I have another move that deals damage in a sort of arc around me, which is good for when they're spread out. It's good, a lot of good single target damage abilities. This giant golem is actually sometimes you'll see these giant red cracks appear, and that's when it goes into sort of berserk mode, where its attacks deal a lot more damage, it moves a lot more quickly, it's just generally harder to deal with. I think it even takes less damage.
So do you find that with the action-oriented gameplay, boss fights in this are much more interesting than, say, watching timers count down in a World of Warcraft match or something like that?
That is definitely the case, and because a lot of the difficulty comes from the boss's movement. And a lot of the time in MMOs, the movement is all coming from the player. The bosses just use attacks on the ground, and the tank, for example, wants to keep the enemy steady. For Tera, that's not usually the case. It's just the boss will jump around wherever, and you have to deal with it. So the boss dies here, and this is where there's little cinematics, and this happens pretty frequently throughout Tera. It'll happen sometimes at the start or end of quests, where it'll just sort of show that something's happening. In this case, it's opening up the rest of the dungeon.
So as Terra is obviously much more action oriented, but what about story? Is story a big part in it, or is it more focused on the action, I guess?
The story, there's certainly story to it. I mean, this dungeon has its own little storyline, and there's actually quest objectives. You have to sort of throw down bombs next to things. Although it seems to me, at least in the early portion of the game, the story is there to drive you to where the quest hubs are. It's not like the Old Republic, for example, where there's like voiceover all the time. Although there are sequences with voiceover, and I haven't seen any examples of like branching storyline. It's there more to give context to the world and to your actions. I don't know how much of an impact you have on the world.
So with the fact that you have these attacks that can sweep and hit multiple enemies at once, are swarming fights like this kind of much more common in this?
They're somewhat common, and what I found interesting is that there's a good mix. These are all trash mobs, and there's a good mix of trash. Right here, there's like just 3 pretty chunky, hard-hitting dudes, and so I was using single-target strong attacks a lot. Before, when there was like huge swarms of enemies, I had to change my attack style pretty drastically, and that actually, it was surprising how much of a difference that made. I had to approach from certain angles to deal the most damage.
So is that something that kind of makes Tera different? Like rather than using active abilities where you're constantly mashing the number keys, it's more like changing your attack stance because it makes your default attacks do different sort of damage?
Yeah, and the attacks, like the attack order, for example, because some combos lead well into single target damage, some combos lead well into multi-target damage. The combos are all, they all like increase the, or at least a lot of them increase the rate of the actual attack. For example, if I did overhand strike just by itself, it takes like 3 seconds for the action to occur, whereas if I use it as part of a combo, it's just immediate.
What about character creation in this game? It seems pretty diverse, obviously. Like you have one guy that's like a hulking tank-looking character, and then... I
mean, those are all different races. We've actually done a character creator commentary, which you can check out on IGN.com. It's actually pretty flexible. You can tweak a lot of the stuff. And you can also make adorable kittens, which is a huge boon for this game. In my opinion, anyway.
I agree.
What's interesting is you'll see, like, light up areas around the ground and stuff. Like right now, there's a big white circle on the ground. That's how you heal most of the time in Tera. You sort of have to predict where your allies are going to it
it's like an AoE heal that just stays on one spot on the ground rather than focused out from the healer.
Yeah, it's sort of it requires the healer to be very much aware of where the allies are where the enemies are, and sort of be very aware of what's about to happen as well as what's currently happening. Group combat in Tera is a lot is very different compared to say World of Warcraft. There's still this sort of fundamental tank healer, damage dealer roles, but because of the action dynamic and because there's no way to target, so you can't just click on a portrait and heal your allies. You have to say, okay, my allies are there, I'm going to throw down a heal. There are abilities that'll like lock on, and there are some heals that will do that. But that means that you have to mouse over wherever the character is in the world, and you have to be within range for that to work.
So I'm getting a kind of Dynasty Warriors vibe from parts of this. Is the combat mostly, mashing the auto attack button, or are there times where you really have to think about perfect dodges, perfect blocking?
I mean, dodging and blocking is really important. For these sort of like waves, it's not so much about mashing the auto attack as much as it is using combos that will lead into the biggest area damage that you possibly can.
When you say combos, is that typically is that done by clicking one mouse button, or is that done by actually using abilities, chaining abilities together into a combo?
It's clicking and chaining combined. Like I said, if the auto attack will lead into a specific attack, or you can trigger the attack automatically, but the rate the attack, like the rate that gets activated, changes. I think the difference between say this and Dynasty Warriors is Dynasty Warriors, when you're fighting things, they just kind of go flying and there's not really any challenge. And in this situation, although there were a whole lot of little things and they were dying pretty quickly, the tank had to keep them on him, because I actually take a lot of damage as a Slayer, and so there was some strategy at the very least, or some tactics involved in fighting those groups of enemies. The dungeon's sort of broken up into these rooms. This is actually the final fight of the game. It starts off with a little wave of...
Well, of what you've experienced, not of the game.
Yeah, not of this dungeon, rather. This is actually, I think, one of the lowest level dungeons. We're fighting some sort of minotaur-looking thing. And you'll see like the healers like throwing up little circles to heal us. And the positioning of the circle is really important because the tank's in the front and I'm in the back, so the healer has to sort of try and position it so that we're both just inside the circle.
Right, but the importance of you being in the back too is also that his big sweeping strikes aren't actually hitting you.
Yeah, exactly. And there are certain races. I think the Castanic race gets bonus damage from attacking behind. I'm not a Castanic. I think I'm an Amon in this situation, or not. No, yeah, an Amon. And so there's definitely some tactical element to the positioning. You can't run through enemies, but you can dodge through them. So that's really important for positioning.
How does dodging actually work?
You bind it to a button, and then some classes will dodge backwards, some classes will dodge forward, some classes will dodge in the direction that they're moving. And some classes don't even have a dodge button, they'll have a block button. I think, for example, a Mystic doesn't have either. He just sort of drops a heal orb that he can pick up and use it on himself. So in the healer's case, it's more about self-preservation through using your healing abilities than dodging or blocking.
So obviously this thing we're seeing is a dungeon, but a lot of the game, is it meant to be played like multiplayer, or is it possible to fight, most mobs by yourself?
I would say it's possible to fight most mobs by yourself. In fact, you might even be able to solo these bosses because you can dodge these attacks, you can block these attacks. It would be really hard, it would take a long time because these bosses have huge amounts of health.
But dodging really does make avoiding combat and saving yourself from taking damage much more viable.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, dodging is super, super important. You'll see a good tank will block when he sees an attack coming. Good damage dealer will duck out of the way when you see the boss about to go berserk. Like right now, I dodged that jump right there. So I think I took a little tiny bit of damage, but not nearly as much as I would have.
So a lot of MMOs, they have different phases for the boss, and you kind of just predict it, but they kind of telegraph it. In this, it's less telegraphing a ability that he's about to use as much as you have to actually read his attacks the way you would in, say, an action game like God of War or Devil May Cry.
That's right. There are still phases for some bosses, but certainly there's an element of being very much aware of what the enemy's doing within each phase. And here you'll actually see, like, this is the second phase of the fight where a second character is introduced, and so you have to sort of take on both at the same time. He's not very strong though, so he goes down pretty quick. This is actually the very end of the fight, and you get some pretty good loot. The looting system, although you see the loot sprayed all over the ground, it's on there's still like need before greed and round robin and sort of stuff.
So when does Tera come out?
Tera is coming out May 1st this year. So you can see a lot more on Tera all throughout the lead up to the game's release and after on IGN.com.